Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub Podcast, I'll be interviewing Luniel de Beer. Based in Idaho, Luniel is a software product and delivery systems architect with over 15 years of experience helping teams work with clarity, confidence, and accountability. He's the creator of the requirements maturation flow and the originator of Producore's capability management system, both designed to address the missing foundations beneath modern software product delivery. His work replaces vague requirements and broken handoffs with structured collaboration, traceability, and readiness gating. You can follow him on LinkedIn at Luniel. Well done getting that. And check out his website at lunieldebeer.info. Along with his colleague, Max Guernsey III, Luniel is co-author of the book Ready, Why Most Software Projects Fail and How to Fix It. In the book, Luniel and Max introduce RMF, the requirements maturation flow, a practical and deeply structured approach to aligning product and engineering without replacing your existing process. Whether you're using Scrum, Kanban, or something custom, RMF helps you stabilize scope, eliminate carryover, and deliver what actually matters. In this interview, we're going to talk about Luniel's background and career, his interests, his book, and then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as an author. So thank you very much, Luniel, for being on a Leanpub podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Len.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you made your way into the career that you've built for yourself.
Sure. So born and raised in South Africa, Afrikaans family. So English is my second language, although I was steeped in that from, still from being young. Most of our church was in English, and I did most of my reading around religion in English. Anyway, and so born and raised there. When I was 10 years old, my dad got himself a Tandy Radio Shack computer, Trash 80.
Okay.
The thing arrived, and the first thing I asked him, can I put it together? He goes, sure, go for it. And I think that's the last time he ever used the computer. I just fell in love with it. Learned how to, just write basic in it. I think it was GW Basic, I think, at the time. I can't remember now. Anyway, so that was still early days. Got myself into that and really just fascinated me. Then eventually, by the time that I was 16, I had moved myself into Clipper and D-based development at the time, and actually started writing commercial software. I actually got clients who paid me and developed some software for them. My first client was a gold and silver smith in the town that I grew up in, and I wrote a payroll system for him. But it was funny, and I think I had mentioned this in our last conversation. I realized over the years that the more and more I started writing software, there was this one thing for me always. I wanted to understand the problem. I wanted to understand, what is it that the client's actually asking me to do? And so I would have them literally teach me how to do their job. And so then I would observe, and then I would try to do it, and they would correct me until I got to a point where I could actually do the job at a reasonable level. And by understanding that, I really kind of steep myself into what their domain is and what their problems are, etc. And then I would go and try and figure out what solution can I create, and then develop it with them and train them. And this way of working went all the way through to the late 90s, right before I came to the States. Started working at a company called Davis Borkum Hare. They were the largest stockbroker in the country at the time, South Africa, and a team of 3 developers that wrote all of the software for the company in-house. And we managed the network and the computers and the printers and training and everything. So it's kind of like the whole gamut, right? But that one thing that still stuck with me the whole time was, writing software based on an understanding of what people were doing and what the problems were that they had. And so I would write the software, I would train them, I would refine it with them, I would write a guide for it. So I would basically do everything around that. And so then I realized that was not something that most people did, or what most software organizations do, and most software developers, especially when I came to the States and I eventually worked at companies like Microsoft. I realized that, yeah, the developers rarely ever actually talk to the client and sit in their environment and learn what they're doing. They get requirements from a product manager or a program manager at the time at Microsoft, and then they would write the functionality. And so there's always seemed to me like a huge disconnect between the actual developers and the stakeholders or customers or um, people that matter when it comes to the writing of the software and the use of that. Anyway, and so that drove me to constantly try to fill that gap. It's like, what's going on? Why is this happening? How can we make sure that we try to bridge that gap, so to speak? But anyway, so along the road, somewhere between the late 90s and kind of the mid 2000s, I did a lot. Sorry, 2010. I did. I worked both in the software industry, but then also tried along the path of some e-commerce, developed some e-commerce sites, and tried my hand at selling direct to consumer products and things like that. And so, kind of a broad experience in working with systems, I guess, and online systems and software, etc. And then I eventually got myself back into a place where I felt that I was really comfortable at, and that is that as I started learning Scrum and worked as a Scrum Master and a product owner and a dev manager places, I struggled at the time, early 2007, 2008. I struggled to really understand what Scrum was about, for instance. And it's like there's all of this. You must do this. You must do this, and you do this, and these ceremonies and all of this, these practices that you're being taught, but when they didn't work or I didn't quite understand why they were put together in that way, I would start going and try to find what the intention behind it was. And so I would start reading, everything that I could find. I'd buy books about it and do searches and read web articles and things like that. And then I'd come back to my team and other people and I tried to explain to them what I had learned and all of that. And so as a result of doing stuff like that, I realized that I had this desire and this love for actually finding information like that, understanding it deeply, and then transferring it to others and helping them understand. Because I realized that most of the people around me were in the same boat, that they didn't understand this stuff. They were just doing what they were being told to do, but questioning, why are we doing that? But the answers weren't always easy to find. So I loved doing that. And so eventually I found myself in more of a consulting role where I was helping people understand these frameworks, understand these practices, and while also practicing it as an individual contributor, but try to bring this knowledge to them that I've gone and try to find for myself in a way that's accessible and help them understand. Now, of course, along the road, make a lot of mistakes and learned a lot of things, right? But and actually that's an interesting thing for me. I realized, I distinctly remember this incident where I talked to a senior software developer about estimation, right? And I was talking about, this, planning poker and using Fibonacci numbers and all of that. And, I was trying to do it all just the right way. And this developer stood back and said, why is this even important? None of it is accurate anyway. They're just all guesses, right? It's, our best guess, but they're not actual, they're not a real recording of what it is. We try our best, but why are we even doing this? And so I would come back with the classic retort on that I had read or was trained in, etc. And she was like, nah, I just don't buy it. And what I realized is my reaction, and then I started seeing this along the line, but I realized that my reaction initially was one of being defensive. Like, you just don't understand it. Right? And I remember that vividly because when I eventually, I think it was Richard Feinstein, physicist, who wrote this article about how to explain things and not understanding things well enough if you can't explain it. So I think one of the things he said, and I'm going to probably misquote it, but the essence was this, is that if you can't explain something simply to a child, you probably don't understand it well enough yourself. And that really hit home for me. And so as I started digging in and learning more, and it's like, okay, so why is it that somebody is defensive against this? And why is it I can't get this idea across to them? I realized that it's probably because I don't understand it well enough. And so I took that to heart and I started digging and digging and digging. And eventually I had to come back to that software developer and say, I'm sorry, you were absolutely right. And we had a laugh about it at a really good time. But what it helped me understand is where my problems were, where my misunderstandings were, where my because I couldn't explain it in a way that actually made sense to that person. And so anyway, so that's these are some of the things that have really stuck with me, which is why I love what I do. And what drives me in doing a lot of the things that I do is this wanting to understand that. And when you get pushback from that, recognizing that if I can't explain it, then I probably am missing some information. So I better go and educate myself even better, or try it and do it myself, so I can actually get the experience and see what they're talking about, etc. And so anyway, so that's kind of my, I'm still just skipping on, kind of skipping on the surface, but that's kind of the progression of what got me to where I'm at now. I've always loved software development since, like I said, since I was 10 years old. I've been in it. It's been my life. But I think the thing that drives me is seeing how much dysfunction there is and how much people are struggling. They're being told to do things, they try to do it, and then they struggle with it. And a lot of what I see in the industry, I would say, and this is my personal opinion, is tantamount to cargo cult. If you're familiar with the concept, what cargo cult is.
Yeah, why don't you just explain it for people listening, and not for me. I know fully well what it is.
Okay,
I'm joking. Yeah.
So so I'm probably going to butcher this. But I'll try my recollection. There's, I think the latest article that I wrote was written in 2006 or something like that. So where they went back, but this came from the islands in the South Pacific, where the U.S. had a base, and these islands were tribal people, had no knowledge of technology, modern technology, or anything like that. But the U.S. Americans had a base there, and I think before them might even have been the British before that. But anyway, so the U.S. had this base, and I think it was, I don't remember exactly when, but early days. And what they would have is they would have a base, and they would have ships come in, and they would airplanes come in, and they would drop supplies, or they would ship supplies in. And the tribes would see what the Americans were doing, what the soldiers were doing, and for them, it looked like the gods were delivering these goods for them, these presents or these supplies for them. And so they didn't understand how this worked. All they could see was kind of what was happening on the surface, right? The troops would march, and they would be, have certain uniforms, or they would, the aircraft would, there would be an air control tower with a traffic controller, and, would speak into a microphone and had headphones on, and all these different things that they would see that the military was doing. And then they would see the result of them bringing in T-shirts and shoes and Coca-Cola and all of these wonderful things that they would actually share with the tribe, with the the people of the tribes, kind of to, as a kind of, I guess I can't even think about the word now. And yeah. I just being nice with them, etc. Right? Yeah. Anyway, and so what these tribes essentially started doing, and this was the fascinating thing, is they started mimicking what the troops were doing. They would start painting their chests in the colors of the uniforms. They would have bayonets made out of bamboo shoots that were shaved off and painted, and they would march just like the troops would march, and all the way to the point of where they would actually build an effigy, essentially, or a replica of aircraft out of sticks and straw, right? And then burn fires. And what they would do is they saw this as a way of appeasing the gods, so that the gods would bring them these wonderful things. And then the military left, and they continued to do it. And in fact, like I said, up until 2006, I think when the Smithsonian article that I read about it, they were still doing this in modern day, practicing the same thing. So it was dubbed cargo cult. I think it's the John Fur. It was the name because I can't remember the history now. But the point though is that they see things on the surface. They don't really understand how it works and how it all connects. But then they practice this and they think that they have to practice it just perfectly, and then these wonderful things would happen. Right? It's like magical thinking almost. If I can just do the ceremony the right way, or I can just have exactly do it the same way as what somebody wrote about or told me on the surface, then maybe I'll get these outcomes, right? And so unfortunately, I've seen this so much in my career in the industry that people are practicing these practices, but don't really understand the true intent is to, for instance, what's the daily scrum in sprint? Where did it come from? What's its entire purpose? And it's not until you actually read up about that and you realize where that even came from prior to Jeff Sutherland and his team adopting it into Scrum. Where did that even come from? And I think it was from Borland at the time. And and then the guy at Borland wrote an article, I believe. This is my memory, which is really not always that good. So I apologize if I'm wrong about the specifics. But I remember reading this, and he was saying, we didn't stand up. What's this daily stand-ups thing? It's like we didn't just talk for 5 minutes or 5 seconds or a minute each. We got together in a conference room. We sat on around a table and we had a long discussion, and everybody talked about what we were doing and where we were, etc. And then we would go off and go and do the thing. And so when I realized that was kind of one of those things where I realized that if you don't understand the intention behind that and where these things come from, why it is that somebody adopted that practice and why it is that they say to do this, then you're operating at a level where you don't really have a deep understanding, which means that you can try to adopt it as is, but you don't understand how to modify it or to adapt it in order to work for your situation. And you don't really understand why you're doing these things, because what's the outcome that you're looking for? What's the problems that you're trying to solve, right? Anyway, so that's where I see
That's very much for sharing all of that. There's a lot to unpack that we can, of course, unpack in the context of discussing the book. Thank you for that explanation of the cargo cult concept. I've come across it many times before, but I would, never really quite sort of understood what it was, and that's very good. This is not to digress, but that reminds me, it reminds me of the way there's a lot of people who, and Richard Hofstadter, the American historian, wrote a little bit about this kind of tangentially, but there are people who think that if they put on, if someone's got like a kind of sport coat with leather patches, maybe glasses, and maybe a bow tie, and they've got a position called professor at the institute, chair of the something or other, and they've got books with like small print and lots of footnotes, they fulfilled the requirements of being an intellectual and engaging in intellectual activity. Maybe they have a podcast, maybe they talk about books and stuff like that. And the thing that's sort of like really frustrating when you come across people who are mired in that mistake is they don't know what they're getting wrong. They don't know what they're missing, right? They think they've fulfilled what's necessary in this context to be an intellectual. But everything is absolutely hollow and mistaken, and kind of like just you want to kind of just go like, you're reduced to saying things like, you just don't get it, man.
Exactly.
It's not enough. Like, and like, that's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like sounds shallow, but it's actually a very deep thing. Like, you really don't understand
Yeah.
what you're not doing here. And so that's a very powerful metaphor. One thing I wanted to, but I do want to digress on one thing before we go on.
Yeah.
Just because it's something that happens so many times with guests on the podcast. What was it like moving from South Africa to, I believe, to Seattle, where I think you first might have I know from LinkedIn.
It was it wasn't it so it wasn't quite as hard as moving here without ever having visited. I had visited several times from South Africa. From the first time I came here with my parents, we spent three weeks here, traveling in 1983, I think, when I was 12 years old. And then over the years, I'd come several times on vacation, and then a few times on business trips as well. And so I had kind of gotten an experience of what it was like here before I moved. But there was some there was some interesting things that happened, especially since in South Africa you have a right-hand steering and drive on the left-hand side of the car, right? So it's like in Europe. Actually, I don't know if the rest of Europe's like that. It's definitely like that in England.
Yes, just Britain in England.
Just in Britain, right?
Yeah.
Exactly right. Anyway, and so I got here. So one of the things I had to get used to was, okay, how do I drive properly? And actually, it scared the heck out of me a couple of times, like pulling it off of a freeway intersection or something like that, and actually pulling out onto the left side of the divide, and suddenly realize, oh, cars are coming back. It's like quickly back up. Anyway, so there was that, but I realized that there were some massive differences between America and South Africa in terms of, I think, what makes America great, in my opinion, the way that the government is set up, the way that it is structured, the way that the people are here. It's much more free in terms of many different things. And it wasn't quite, some of that wasn't quite as prevalent for me as when I went and visited Canada after having been here in the States for a little bit, and realizing how Canada's set up, and especially laws and how things work there, is very much the same as what is in South Africa, which was very British, of itself. And that's actually really different, so much different from America. But it was, when I got here, for me, it's obviously I'd already been speaking English, but more British English, South African style British English, which meant that I have my own pronunciation and vocabulary and a few faux pas in by saying a word that meant something wrong here and not so much, not there at all, which is like, we say the word and then realizing it's like people cracking up laughing, or, like, oops, we don't use that word here. Things like that. So that was that. I think for me, the biggest thing was trying to understand the American way of life, trying to understand how people behave here, how people, work, how they, so I think those were the things that really stood out for me. But living in it was different from just visiting and seeing it as a tourist, if you will, right? So I don't know. I felt comfortable. I felt really like I enjoyed it, and it felt that this is really the place where I wanted to be. I knew from early on already after my travels that I wanted to come to the States. I had tried several different times in different ways to try and figure out how can I make my way to the States, because I wanted to come and live in America. I wanted to immigrate here, not just come and work here, but actually become an American, right? Now, of course, I still sit with this where I have the imposter syndrome, because I can hear my accent every now and again, especially now since I'm listening to it halfway through my headphones as well. But it's even more prevalent when I listen to myself off of a recording. I'm like, what? I sound like that? But so knowing that I've embraced the American, I became a citizen in 2008, and eventually, but embraced, this is my country. I gave up my South African citizenship, and this is where I am, and this is my life for me here.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned the freedom thing, and that just reminds me of something in my own experience that I just want to see if maybe there's another similarity between Canada and South Africa. So, to make a very broad generalization, if you just independently do something in Canada, like I, co-founded a kind of attempt at a major poetry prize years ago, and if you try and do something like that, you will encounter people who are like, they won't put it this way, but it's basically like, who gave you permission? Who gave you the authority? Who are you to do this? And it's a deeply kind of institutionalized mindset where people think they're kind of being kind of prideful defenders of something inchoate, some structure or order, by objecting to you just sort of up and doing something. And of course, in the United States, it's not like that at all. Like if you sitting next to someone at the bar and you say you tried something like that, they'd be like, "Wow, cool! What a great idea," you know,
Yeah.
or "What a terrible idea," or whatever. But they wouldn't question your right, as it were, to just up and do something.
Yeah.
Isn't
Or even your authority, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, does that compare to your experience of sort of the culture you grew up in?
In I No, it's not.
Okay,
And
okay.
especially in the Afrikaans culture as well, we're
Mm.
it's much more a Dutch and French
Uh,
origin. Um, in the on the Afrikaans side of
yeah,
things, not so much the English side. So it's like South Africa has this, at least it was like that. I don't know if it's still like that. I haven't been there for a long time. But I mean, I lived there for 28 years, born
yeah.
and raised there, right?
Mhm.
27 years, my apologies. And then, but there was this kind of this thing between the Afrikaans and the English, right?
Right.
And we would tease them mercilessly, and they would tease us mercilessly, right? And all of that. And so in the business world, you're steeped in the business world, which is different from social English, and the Afrikaans social is different as well. But the Afrikaans social is just fiercely independent and fiercely entrepreneurial. And so I don't remember any of or running into any of that just in general within the community there, just because it's so independent.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. That I find that kind of thing so totally fascinating, and it's rare to get a
Yeah.
chance to talk to someone who's thoughtful about these things and can explain like that. So I've got one more thing before we get to one more narrative thing before we get to the book. So you wrote it with your colleague Max Bernzi.
Yes.
Um, uh, can you tell us a little bit about how you and Max met and what it is that you do together today?
Sure. Um, so Max and I met as was it 2015, I think is when I met Max. He had already been working at a company called Net Objectives, and I um I ended up there as well, and met him. And in the beginning, he and I didn't work together a lot. For when I say in the beginning, like for the first probably 6 months or so. And then, but at company meetings, excuse me, we would start having some conversations, and eventually I got into behavior-driven development. Or at least at the time when what it was called, there was acceptance test-driven development, or ATDD. Um, and his focus was on technical practices and on teaching and coaching these practices. Yeah, I think at the time he had already written the book, Agile. Is it? I think it was like Agile database development.
Yes,
Max, I
that's the one.
apologize that I don't remember your book, right? But basically, it's applying these practices to database development, etc. Right? And so as I found myself learning about ATDD, um, I ended up rubbing shoulders with him, and eventually we were at the same client engagements, working together to teach ATDD together. And the more that we worked together, we've found that there was some really interesting conversations that we had, because I would bring my side, especially from the product side of things, and he would bring his technical side of that, and help me kind of refine my thinking as well about that. Now, we weren't the only two people. There were a lot of other people within the company who were doing this as well, um, teaching the ATDD course, and so it was as a group of that. But I think eventually over the time, and especially after um, I think after we had both left Net Objectives, we found ourselves working together in some client engagements. But even while we were at Net Objectives, I remember us sitting together after certain trainings, and getting together and discussing certain concepts. Um, and we just, I guess we just hit it off in terms of our thinking. And but then in trying to actually apply ATDD on the ground, and then eventually BDD, and working together, and in different settings where I had some idea that I had, and then he would sit and help me kind of get that idea out and flesh it out and actually make sense of this muddled idea in my head, if you will, right? I see the problem, I see kind of the solution, I have an understanding in my mind of the solution, and I would, kind of share it with him, and then he would sit down with me and say, okay, let's ferret this out. Let's pull out the things that really are important to this and kind of distill it down to its essence, so we really understand what the problem is that we're trying to deal with, and what the thing is that we need to do, and then bring that kind of. So it's like I have these ideas, and he helped me operationalize it, so to speak. And so with that work, we just ended up, I guess, kind of getting closer and closer in terms of our working relationship with that, and lots of deep philosophical discussions around that. And then eventually, we ended up working on an engagement together for almost a year and a half, where we were working almost every single day. And we would pair together. So we ended up actually pairing on requirements writing, on writing Gherkin specifications, and pairing on working with the teams to hand it off with the teams and to verify that they were doing this stuff. And so we ended up for almost a year working, again, almost daily, all day long, in pairing sessions, working on these things. And so that led to deep, lengthy philosophical discussions, but also understanding a lot of what these problems were that we were trying to solve, and built essentially the structures and solutions around that to solve those problems. And I think that's what led us to the point of where we finally said, hey, yeah, there's some stuff that we could actually bring to the world together as a result of our learning and our, the work that we had done. And so we ended up forming a company together, Producore, and decided that based on our experience, my side being focused on kind of the product side of the equation, especially, I am not a product designer, as Marty Kagan would call it, or product creator, sorry. I am, my focus is not going out in the marketplace and trying to find what the product is, kind of on a product strategy side of things, right? There are people who are phenomenal at that, and I've worked with amazing people, product managers who do that. That's their passion, right? On the kind of the strategy and the marketing side, and understand how to kind of position the product and what features we need to build to solve these problems, and the problems that we should solve, and segmentation and all that. My focus is on kind of saying, okay, you've got these wonderful ideas, right? And how do we actually how do we turn that into a real working software, right? Because the more and more I worked on this, I saw this gap oftentimes between product strategy, if you will, and the actual engineering side, the implementation side. And because of, like I said, my history of wanting to be trained by the customer and understanding the problem and then writing the software, I found myself in this position where I love bridging this gap. And anyway, and so I bring that side of it, understanding the strategy side, not being an expert in it, but understanding what it brings and what they do, etc. But then understanding how to actually translate that, go from their kind of high-level strategic ideas and initiatives and kind of features that they want to build and customer experiences they want to enable, to how do I write the actual specifications and provide this back and forth handoff between them and the software development teams that in the end will actually provide what's expected, the outcomes. Right. And then Max, of course, brings the side of the engineering, the deep technical practices and the design expertise and all of that he brings to the table. And so we realized that because we see these things from both sides, or at least we bring both sides of this equation, we can actually interface together. We can have these conversations about saying, what is it that's going to be best for you on the technical side to be able to get this information? What format should you get it in? How should we work together to make sure that this results in success for you to be able to deliver what's being expected and create this alignment? But also at the same time, how do we do it in a truly agile way where we get something out so we can get the feedback, but only get the absolute minimum piece out that we have to in order to actually go and vet it and get that out so we can do this incremental building and incremental development and kind of evolution of the system. And then the same thing on my side is like, how do I make sure that as from a product side and requirements perspective, that I get the feedback that I need from the engineering side and structure this stuff so that we can actually work together and create this seamless back and forth handoff and collaboration. There is a handoff. I mean, that's just people don't like the idea that there's this handoff. Some people don't like that, but there is a type of a handoff because as the product owner, you're not actually sitting in there coding it. You're not sitting there doing the manual testing unless you're doing acceptance testing, but lower level. You're not doing automated testing or unit testing, etc. Use your engineers that actually do that, right? Software engineers, right? So there is some kind of a handoff, but it still needs to be collaborative, and it still needs to be this seamless work that needs to work together. And so that's where we decided, okay, what do we want to do in Producore? Producore for us was an attempt to essentially solve the problem of where a lot of software is engineering driven, if you will. A lot of clients that we would go into, they would not really have much of a product management function. It would be the engineering function that drives most of the development. But then there were problems because are they really hitting the market? Are they really solving the actual problems that they need to? Are they really positioning the product in a way that actually solves the market needs? Now, if it's a highly technical product like an API or a set of APIs or something like that. Now, of course, your clients are developers, you understand them, etc. But if it's actual end users of a UI or some other thing, some person that is not very technical, then you have to have someone that bridges that gap. But a lot of times you saw that engineering would create that and drive that. So at the same time, I realized with a lot of my struggles over the years that there was still this predominant mindset in software development about project management. And people who know me very close understand how I have been railing against that for years, because it is essentially thinking about software as if it's a one-off thing. Because most projects are one-off things. And even though we do the same projects, the project has a start and an end, right? We get a budget, we pull the right resources together, we pull the people together to create this, finish this project. We plan everything out. We have Gantt charts. We manage resource allocation and manage the project to a deadline, to an end, making sure it's on time, on budget, right? But my lived reality was that software had started moving away from that. Software no longer is so much of a product as it is a service. It is a thing that is continuously evolving. And even attempts to build products as single one-offs, we still end up struggling with that because we had to build version 2 and version 3 and version 4 and version 5. And a lot of times it would just start from the beginning. Right. And so how do you then treat software not as a project, but as a living organism, if you will, that has to continuously be evolved and maintained in order to address market forces, business needs, customer needs, etc. Right. And so that led me to understand that the whole approach to developing software as a project, where I'm going to go and sit down and say, okay, we can have this initiative and I need to get funding for it. And then I need to staff for it. And we're going to write all the specs for it and implement it. And then we're going to drive to this deadline and this end. When that is done, is flawed fundamentally. It's thinking about that as I'm going to go build an asset rather than I have an asset. I have an asset that needs to continuously evolve in order to serve the needs, which means it is an operational thing in the business, right? You don't, and then I realized that there was this fundamental difference, it seemed like, between companies who do software development as a primary competency and companies who do that as a secondary or tertiary competencies. right? Companies that did some other type of business, retail or manufacturing or whatever it was, and then eventually they need to start developing software. And I know of some companies that ended up actually buying the companies that were developing their software for them, because the software became such an integral part of the operation that the risk of having some outside company develop and maintain it for them became too large. So they just buy the company out.
Right.
And now suddenly they find themselves with a software development division, but they have no experience in actually writing software and maintaining it, right? And so, but the only thing that they have that they can bring to this is this project management mindset, because that's how most of the non-software development business works, is through projects and initiatives, right? Anyway, and so I struggled with seeing how companies were really struggling with that, especially when they were adopting agile frameworks like Scrum and trying to kind of retrofit it almost in order to do the project management. But anyways, so long story short, all of these different things and these challenges that we saw, we decided that what we want to bring to the world is two things. One is we want to help the world, the software development world, turn to being product driven, not project driven or even engineering driven. It needs to be product driven, where you really understand, or even you can go even further and say solution driven. Like, what's the real solution? What's the problem that you're actually trying to solve here? And that means that people have to understand the problems and they have to come up with the solutions and then help drive the software development in order to actually solve those problems, right? So that's the one aspect. So how do you make sure that engineering is actually product driven, solution and problem and solution driven? And then also, how do you help companies to set up the ideal software product development environment? And so that became kind of the foundation for us for what we decided to do within Producore. And the book Ready is really our attempt to publish to the world this structured gating mechanism that I had developed over time, and that Max had helped me refine, and that we had applied at so many different customers, a lot of that on my own without Max's involvement initially before we were working together, and seeing that kind of morph to solve these problems for the teams on the ground, but also for the organizations. And then take that and say, okay, let's bring that out to the world as a formal thing. Let's publish it, and let's make sure people understand why this is a necessary thing. Because so many people, it's a counterintuitive thing. And it actually kind of flies, on the surface, when you first see it, it seems to fly in the face of agile, which is working software over process, right? Or people over process, right? And things like that, right? So it's like, but it's not, that wasn't the intent. The intent was to say, you've got frameworks like Scrum, but Scrum is fundamentally a work management framework. It's a way to say, okay, I have a backlog for a product that we're developing and have developed and continue to develop. How do I build that backlog? How do I burn that backlog down in an incremental and agile fashion, right? So it's really about managing the work. And I think Jeff Sutherland had actually told how this genesis came to be, because he was talking to, I think it was the CEO of the company that he was working at the time, and who was asking for Gantt charts. And he said, well, what about instead of Gantt charts, I show you this other way? We developed this other way of actually giving you information that you can really make a decision on, informed decisions on, rather than just trying to see, are we going to be on time and budget? Because this constant shifting and learning that we have to incorporate, and understanding how this backlog is evolving from our understanding, so you can actually understand how that is burning down. And that was really, so it's still as a way to manage this backlog and this work, etc., right? And so frameworks like that do not actually address the product management side of things, right? They're work management, and it Scrum is said to be a software product development framework, but yet it's so generic, if you will, so lightweight that people have used it in so many non-software development environments. They've used it to, I think Jeff talks about it in some of his talks and in his book, one of his books that he wrote, that it was applied to running a teacher running his classroom. I think that was in the Netherlands, and church managing the church and all the work, CEO managing his whole team of work that they needed to do. Even the FBI actually ended up using that. I don't know if they ended up using it for software, but I thought it was for. So there's all these different things that Scrum ends up actually being able to be applied to. So it's this lightweight framework, and then you can add into it, like a framework of a house, the things that you need in order to succeed in whatever it is that you're trying to do, but with Scrum as a way to manage the workload, right? So it does not provide you with guidance on product management practices, right? It just says that you have a backlog of work. It doesn't tell you how do you get to that backlog? How do you build it? How do you understand the product strategy side of things? How do you write requirements? Now, a lot of people say, sure, Scrum says user stories. Well, no, Scrum does not provide you any guidance on how to write a requirement, because that's not what Scrum is about. So, but then a lot of companies who were not familiar with and weren't software as a primary competency would take Scrum and essentially think that that is the guide to how to do software development. So these things are missing.
Yeah, and so that's very interesting. And so let's maybe drill down into a very specific.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's just I really like a really great explanation. And for anyone who's going to read the book, that will make a lot of sense. The structure of the explanation that Luniel just gave of what to get to this point. But so the reason I jumped in was I thought this was a great point to sort of you use the word requirement, I think, for the first time just now. And so let's dive into what that is. So for example, in Scrum, you've got a product backlog item set, right? And so you've defined we need these things, right? For our software product features. And a requirement might be, so we're going to say, we're building some kind of online platform and it's going to have accounts. And so then you add you need a feature, which is an confirmation email.
Okay.
Click here to confirm that you signed up for this, that this was you signing up for this account and it's really you. And we were all familiar with this from doing things online.
Yeah.
So a requirement would be a sort of very a kind of almost empty requirement would be build an email confirmation step, go, right? Now, what you're saying in your book is that requirement is not ready to be passed on to a development team. And so given that very sort of cartoonishly simple example, why is that requirement not ready?
It is, well, first of all, if you give that to a development team and say, go and build, then what are they actually going to build for you? And how do you know that they're going to build exactly what it is that you and or the customers need without, for instance, asking questions? Like you can say, here's the story. And here's what the function or the feature that we want to build, right? And you can say, so that we can make sure. So if there has to be a confirmation or like a second pass, we say, do you confirm that you want to subscribe to this mailing list, like this double opt-in type of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Why do we have that? So what's the reason behind that? So there is an you obviously you want to provide an understanding of who's the kind of target customer or user or stakeholder for this. What is this thing that we want, but then why do they want that as well? And the classic user story format, as it is used today, is this format of, as a actor or persona that you want to put in, I want this thing so that I can do this other thing, right? So it's like, so that I can accomplish this particular goal or solve this problem of mine. But it's still a very high level understanding of almost the business case, if you will, the business driver for that. But even me as a former software developer, I am no longer a software developer. I haven't been for a long time, but even as a former software developer, that would never be good enough. I would have to ask so many questions, right? What about this? What do you mean by that? And when we built that and somebody uses that, what about all of the details of when there's a problem that happens or some variation of that? What if the email can't be sent? What if it bounces back? What if the person tries to put the wrong email in, et cetera, right? And so,
should it be in? Is the
yes, you name it.
internationalization already built into the product?
No.
Yeah.
What should it look like, right?
And the reason I bring up that sort of, that might sound to people like a very, like, who are familiar with product development and coding and stuff like that. That might sound like an absurdly simple thing, but there is a kind of flavor of management where people think they're being hard-nosed and no nonsense by framing their requirements that way, right? It's a culture of like kind of being, it's a sort of like kind of false, like there's fool's gold. It's like fool's realism, Well, I said, we all know what an email confirmation is. What questions could you possibly have to ask? And then
Exactly.
because there's that culture of being this sort of theater of being tough and hard nosed, well, you as the kind of subordinate in the hierarchy, to management often, and if you're in product development, that's probably the position that you're in. You kind of have to just eat it and go off
Exactly.
and do something. And then that builds all kinds of resentments and distrust and kind of like lack of communication. And so one thing I really like about your book is that it's like it plays to that hard-nosed tenor
Yes.
very well. But introducing the idea that like this isn't just extra, this isn't worry warding, this isn't extra planning. If you just have a proper understanding of what it means for a requirement to be ready to be handed off, you will save yourself endless problems you don't even know that you have. Literally, you can't see that you actually have it right in front of your face. If you can just do that. And so you do this through, there are three foundational practices, as you call them in the book. RMF1, collaborating for shared understanding. RMF2, gating completion of work using bespoke definitions of done. And then RMF3, gating implementation using bespoke definitions of ready.
Yes.
And so now I've just dumped all this on you, but if you want to, if you could maybe take a couple of minutes to talk about each of those steps. And I know that you actually have on your website for Producore, you have different programs for each of these modules, I guess, that people who are listening or are interested in, like, how can I bring this into my company? They can sign up for, in addition to buying the book. So can you, I'll just sort of just say, can you talk for a few minutes about RMF1, collaborating for shared understanding?
Yeah, if you take this notion of what we've just talked about, getting the development team engineers to actually understand what is being asked of them to develop. I didn't get to that, but the user story format I want, so that it's essentially, it is a promise for a conversation. That was what it was intended to be right from the beginning. I think Alistair Coburn, Kent Beck, and Mike Cohen have actually talked about this extensively from their early days, the 3C and XP days, early days around this, where they talked about this story format, if you will, this story card, as literally, I'm going to write down what it is that we want, who wants it, and why they want that, but it is meant to be a promise for a conversation. In other words, we can bring that as a representation of the thing that we want to do, but at some point in time, we're essentially, through that, we're promising the development team that we're going to have a conversation with them about that, but also to the customer that we're going to have a conversation with them about that, and the engineers are going to be able to actually delve into this to really understand the details of this thing that they want, And unfortunately, as a result of like the further away people got from these roots and the initial intent behind that, and just adopting Scrum training and saying, learning how to write a user story, and some throw in the idea of the acceptance criteria that they put into that, we somehow seem to have lost this understanding that there needs to be a conversation. And that conversation is something that is crucial that you need to have. So what RMF1 the first thing that it tries to do is tries to create the time and the space for development teams to have those conversations to the point of where they completely understand and they have a shared understanding with the requester, and hopefully even the actual not the so in Scrum you've got the product owner who's the proxy for the customer, right? So at some point in time we want to make sure that the engineering team or the engineering teams want to make sure that they have a shared understanding between the requester and the implementer, if you will. And that takes time. That can take a long time. My personal experience is it can take weeks to actually sometimes get to the point of where we have clarity on what the details are behind that. Because sometimes I have to go chase the answers to questions with different stakeholders. They might not be available, and we have to go and do some research on that, etc. So, trying to lump that all together in a very we're just going to need an hour for that and then it's done is actually very unrealistic, or at least to the level of detail that I expect it to be done. It's very unrealistic. And I think most developers will tell you that, yeah, that's not enough for them to succeed in all of the information that they need to get. So it attempts to create this time and space for them to be able to gain this shared understanding. But shared understanding, as you create this shared understanding, the requirement evolves as well because more details are being added to it. You understand the scope, you understand what's not in scope, you can make decisions about what to defer, etc., what trade-offs to make, etc. So essentially the requirement through that, it ends up maturing. So you have a complete understanding of what it is. It's at a point of where everybody agrees that this is the right requirement. It truly represents what we need to go and implement. Both sides understand it in such a way that the chance of two people understanding it differently is almost eliminated. That's what we are after, right? And then, so it creates the time and space for them because nowhere in the Scrum framework does it give you a mechanism to do this. And most people think that that's just part of the product backlog item. You just need to do that while you're developing. Well, that's not realistic. So what we do with that is we're in RMF1, we say, no, that should not be lumped in with the implementation work because that sets you up for failure. Because you have a 2-week sprint, for instance, or even more aggressively, a 1-week sprint. There's almost no way that you're going to be able to succeed in, I want this high-level story that I just gave you, this high-level description I want so that I can get this, right? That you're going to be able to get all of the questions answered, get the shared understanding and mature understanding of that, and implement it and test it and make sure that it actually meets that expectation in a 1-week period. It's like, that's just unrealistic. So it says, okay, most people don't understand that has to happen inside when they're the further away they are from that. So it creates this ability to separate this creation of the shared understanding, maturation of the requirement from the implementation work. So now in Scrum, you can take that, you can schedule it, you can do as many of these, have as many of these product backlog items, if you will, to get the requirement, the actual main work item ready for implementation as you need. And then you can take the implementation once it's ready and put that in. That's the first RMF, right? Sorry, I know I'm long-winded about.
No. That's I love that. That's a really great explanation. And just to sort of give people an image, this is one we came up with when we were doing the launch video for the book a little while ago. But was cooking, and an example would be, and I'm very partial to this line of thinking, right? That for example, let's say you're a chef and you've got 3 or 4 assistants, and you've got to prepare, roast beef and potatoes for the pub or something like that, right? And you've never been in the kitchen before, and it's like we've got to have this done in 3 hours, ready for 100 people who are going to be coming in and out in this, say, an English pub in the afternoon on Sunday. One thing you can do is just go over there and start chopping onions, and you go over there and you start boiling the water. Or another thing you can do is actually, so you've got 3 hours to deadline. One thing you can do is take 10 minutes to just think about it and talk it through. And then, talk to the person who's going to be doing the potatoes, and they're like, well, the water's over there, but the pans are over there, and then the stove is over here. And then the person who's going to be chopping onions is like, yeah, the knives are between the cutting board is between the stove and the where the pots are for boiling the water. Maybe if we just switch those around, onion person and potato person won't end up kind of running into each other all the time.
Yeah.
And just by having those kinds of, like, that's the point being that, of the point I'm trying to make with the analogy is that it's not extra planning. It's not just adding planning on top that's unnecessary or something like that. It's modeling the activity that you're going to be undertaking later. And letting the people who have the different responsibilities, promising them a conversation, as you said, letting them know that they're going to be able to talk with each other, can make everything work way better and more efficiently going forward. And then, the analogy is, that, like, things that you didn't understand, that people bumping into each other all the time when you were cooking was a problem. You just thought that was a part of the nature of cooking together in a kitchen, right? But then when you've actually done this exercise, you can see, oh, that thing that's happening all the time that I just saw as inevitable, or didn't even see happening because it was so normal, is actually a problem that we can eliminate. And that's one of the things I really love about Ready, and the like requirements maturation flow. So, just in the interest of time, moving on to RMF2, gating completion of work using bespoke definitions of done. So what's that mouthful all about?
Well, it's about recognizing the fact that every single work item, every single request for an implementation of some functionality, is unique in software. And not only do you have to have a shared understanding of what it is that's being asked, in terms of functionality and the nuances and the scope of that, you also need to understand, what does completion look like when this thing is done, right? We need to have completed this. We need to have completed that. So the software itself needs to function, but maybe we also need to have automated tests in place. We also need to have made sure that, if you're a software, from an engineering perspective, we have coding standards. How do we make sure that those coding standards and practices are adhered to? For instance, maybe any code needs to be reviewed by at least one other developer who wasn't involved in the actual writing of the code. Perhaps we need to make sure that certain design standards are being followed. Maybe there needs to be an architectural review that needs to happen. Is there documentation that needs to be updated or even created? What about testing, test automation, manual testing? What are all of the things that we need to understand should be in place and have been completed by the time that we're done with this project? A simple way of thinking about that is, well, if we're going to give the user, if we're going to give the restaurant customer the plate of Irish stew or fish and chips, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we plate it? Is there a particular plating? Do we have to clean up behind that?
Right.
Do we need to clean our workspace here? What are all of the things that really marks completion, like real completion of this? And some of these things are in the control of the team, and the team is expected to do that, and some of them are outside of the control. So let's be very clear that we understand all of these things that can potentially need to be done for a work item. So the bespokeness is recognizing the fact that every one of these work items is unique. Some have more, some have less, and there's often differences in what needs to be done. So we teach teams to create essentially a template that is a pick list of all the things that typically might be included in a definition of done. And then when you create the definition of done, as part of the shared understanding, you're also, this work that you're doing up front before implementation, you also create a shared understanding of what done looks like. And you use this template for the definition of done, and you create a bespoke, a custom made to fit definition of done for the work item.
Right.
That is a way for everybody to agree that, yes, when all of these things have been completed and have been done, then we will accept this as done, right? No questions asked. It's like setting a contract almost in place, but it's an agreement between the requester and the development team. But at the same time, it gives the development team a list of things that they can go back and reference. Did we do this? Did we do this? Did we do this? Did we do this? And that understanding not only allows them to plan properly for it, but it also allows them to make sure that they didn't forget things, and that when they say something is done, they can step back from this and feel absolutely comfortable that, yes, this is done. We did everything that was being asked for. Everything that was documented is done. We've marked it, checked it, we've verified it. There you go. Right now we can have our discussions and demos about it, but there's nothing left, and we're not going to end up like having egg on our face, so to speak, right? Because we forgot to do that, or we forgot to do that.
And I think you mentioned this in the book, but if that level of trust, like systematically designed trust, unlocks basically a kind of superpower, right? Because if you can know when this is handed off to you in this state, know that you can just proceed with the next step without having to circle back or double check or what have you. When you just know you can go to the next step, that is like profoundly changes the way you can do things going forward.
It's liberating, and it builds trust tremendously, right?
Yeah. And so RMF3, and my test of you here live is RMF3 is gating implementation using bespoke definitions of ready. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, we've already said that some things need to be done before implementation starts. Right? Shared understanding is one of them, of the requirements. Having a bespoke definition or understanding a customized definition of done, bespoke definition of done, understanding of what done is, should be in place before you start implementing it, right? So we already have this understanding that there's this kind of this need for a way to say we're not ready to implement this work item because there are things that we still need to do, questions we need to ask, conversations we need to have, and an understanding that needs to be documented of what the requirements are, what the scope is, and what all of these done criteria are for this work item. So, so we need a gate. We need ability to say this thing is not ready. And so that in of itself already is a it's exposed this need to have this gating mechanism. Now you can say, well, okay, because we have those two things, every single work item needs to have those two things: shared understanding and definition of done, right? Okay, but is it bespoke? Does it have to be bespoke? No, that doesn't have to be bespoke. But then the more that we start looking at other reasons why teams fail to complete work within a sprint, and end up carrying over from sprint to sprint to sprint, even when they have shared understanding and even when they have a bespoke definition of done that they meticulously followed, there are other things that also cause failure and prevent them from completing. And those are things such as, are all the external dependencies resolved? If we're waiting on some team to develop some a service or something like that we're going to have to use in order for us to develop this and be able to say, yes, it works, and verify and validate that it actually works against that properly, then if we start implementing, but that's not done, and then halfway through the implementation, the team finishes it, but then, as is often the case, what is delivered has actually changed because they ran into something. So now suddenly the service that we were trying to use, we were working against an understanding of how we're going to interface with that. That's changed. So now we have to change what we implemented. Or there's some constraint or something that we now have to suddenly work around. This is an unexpected roadblock, if you will. So now that leads to rework. What if that team is not able to complete the work? Now we're not able to complete our work, and now we've gone halfway through, and now we have to stop. We can't finish it because we're waiting on this external thing. Sometimes it's an external vendor that has to supply something, or access to external systems, or even internal systems, but that's outside of the control of the team. So that's a classic problem that can be prevented. And so if you have this discussion about what are the things that we need to have in place before we start, you can now elaborate on that, and you can actually define that for that work item. We need documentation, we need access to this system, we need this external dependency resolved, this information. Like, for instance, I think Max loves this as one of his classics is we need test data from somewhere else. We don't create the test data, but we need that. So when is that going to be created? And we can't go and do the testing without the test data. So let's document all these different things that we need to have in place before we can actually know that, before we can succeed, right? And then we start looking beyond that. It's not just what's external, but what's internal. Do we need to go and do research to actually understand how the system today is functioning, so we even can get a good understanding of what we're going to have to go and do in terms of maybe design changes? Do we need to go refactor the system in some way or the other? Then what about things such as, do we have the skills? Do we have the people? Maybe we need to go hire some people with some specific skills because we've now taken on a new branch of work or type of work and we don't have the ability to do it ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. So when you take a look at a work item, along with the shared understanding, along with this customized definition of done, bespoke definition of done, also create a customized understanding, bespoke and to fit for this work item, to understand what everything else needs to be in place before we can say that we're ready to implement it, above the shared understanding and the definition of done.
In the last part of the interview, when the guest is a Leanpub author, I always like to ask them a couple of questions about their work writing. So you and Max co-authored this book, and I'm just curious how you managed that. Did you like say, I'm going to do this chapter? Did you outline it in advance and assign a chapter to each person, and then edit it when the other person took the lead? Did you schedule times like, every Saturday afternoon I'm locking myself in a room? How did you just generally approach the project?
That morphed over time. In
Right.
the beginning, Max and I we would have pairing sessions, and we would sit and we would write it together. He would write some, I would write some, and Max is an extremely fast typer. Turns out he's also an extremely fast writer. He has this ability to get the thoughts out of his head and into prose or into copy really, really quickly, much faster than I can. And so as a result of that, those initial attempts at doing that, which really worked very well, we realized that there were some strengths and some weaknesses. I need some time to think about things and write it and rewrite it. Max has this ability to take an idea, just flow with it and write it. And then I would go back. And so in the end, a big part, actually probably the lion's share of this book, the majority of this book, was we initially came up with the outline, agreed on the kind of the story arc and the progression of that, and what is it that we wanted to what lessons we wanted to share, and what is that progression, what we want you to accomplish with that. And then we basically, Max would actually take that, and we had come to the agreement that he would just take that and he would just start writing, because I trust him so much in his understanding of this. And so he would actually go and write a lot of the stuff, and he's extremely fast with it. And then I would go back and I would read it, and then we would have our pairing sessions, and I would push back on things and he would push back on things, and then I would go and suggest some edits and actually even write some parts of that, right? And then he would, and so a lot of this was Max doing a lot of the actual writing, basically taking the ideas that I had in my head and understanding it so well that he could write a lot about that. But then we would go through endless cycles. It felt sometimes like of reviewing and revising, and we ended up having to rewrite some sections because we realized later on that, we stumbled on something. But one thing that we realized in our collaboration, just like anything else that we've done together in pairing sessions, is we would come to points where we would butt heads. He would have something that he pushes back on strongly, and then I would push back on that again. And in the end, what we end up with is something more than either of us had even thought about in the beginnings, and something that just is beautiful. So that's how it just went through the whole time with this writing. And thanks to Max for doing the vast majority of the actual typing, and he set up the structure for us in GitHub, for all of the Markua files and all of that, and created that whole structure. So yeah,
that actually very, very briefly leads me to the last question I always like to ask, actually, which is if when you were using Leanpub or thinking about using Leanpub, and there was one magical feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing that had you shaking your fist at us going, damn you, why does this suck so bad? Why can't you fix this stupid, easy problem? Can you think of something that you would ask us to do?
Actually, there were several defects that we had found that were resolved by the team very, very quickly. But I think some of it was more structural. I think there was one of the things where we had added a glossary at the end, and adding the glossary, and then actually having images on the glossary. Now, throughout the rest of the book with Markua, you have the cross links, right? And you can create cross links, and you can say, okay, give me the name of this cross link that you're linking to, and if it's an image, right, then it's a figure, this, that, and the other, and then a name to it. Well, for when we set up the glossary section of the book, which is different from the rest of the book, those crosslinks didn't work. I think they still don't work correctly. So we had scratched our head a lot, and we actually found a way around that. But in the beginning, it was like, why did that happen? But I think that's like a one little like minute thing, but I don't know. I think that you've provided a system and an infrastructure that really, I can think about it. Some way for, if I'm a developer, if I'm not a coder, not a developer, but I really want to use Leanpub in the absolute best way possible. Is there a template, like a blank template that I can get from you to say, here is a way for you to structure it in GitHub, instead of having to go and read all of the source and try to figure out, how do I set up these parts and these parts? You might have that, and Max might know about that, but I didn't see that.
We don't have something sort of truly comprehensive, but there is a default new book template in GitHub under the Leanpub account.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, well,
so you can just go use this default repo, and then it sort of sets things up. And if you know, you still have to know a little bit, but like, like a little bit of programming kind of to know this.
You got to learn the language too.
Yeah, exactly. But like for most things, it's relatively straightforward. But yes, there is a default repo. Well,
okay. There you go. So I didn't really have anything to add then.
Yeah. Well, so Luniel, thank you very much. No, thank you very much for sharing that. All that feedback is gold. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me and to talk to our audience about this really great book. It's Ready: Why Most Software Projects Fail and How to Fix It. And thank you very much for sharing some of your story as well. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you, and likewise to you. Thank you for taking the time to actually discuss this with me. I appreciate that very much.
Thanks.